My latest video explored the potential origins of the Etruscans. My running hypothesis is that the Etruscans descended from the Pelasgians and further from the Anatolian Neolithic farmers, with some admixture from later groups. If you want to know more, you can watch that video before this one. In this video, we're going to start our investigation into the Etruscan mythology and religion, with one of their most important gods, Voltumna. In order to understand him, we'll trace his variations and evolutions to a variety of pantheons, from Neolithic European and Anatolian to Minoan Crete and Pelasgian Greece. Join me on this journey and leave me your thoughts and questions in the comments, so that I might respond to them during my upcoming live stream. Long before the rise of Rome, Athens, Mycenae, and the Hittites, before Jupiter, Zeus, Tarhona, and Tinia ruled the heavens with their thunderbolts, there was another king of the gods. He had many names, including Voltumna, Vertumnus, Velchanos, and Attis. But over time, his story was lost, buried beneath the myths of later Indo-Europeans. But who was he? Today, we will investigate his forgotten nature. The predominant political model of the Etruscans was a league of city-states, similar to the Sumerian, Phoenician, and Greek models. Their Neolithic ancestors settled on the frontier, far from the rising powers of the Bronze Age Fertile Crescent. Safe from such imperial threats as the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Hittites, there was no pressing need to unify politically, at least not until the rise of the Romans, although Rome was so deeply influenced by the Etruscans that a hypothetical Etrurian empire may not have looked much different from the Roman Empire of our own timeline. Even the Akkadian Empire, the first recorded in history, was not founded by the Sumerian city-states themselves, but by Semitic slaves and mercenaries like Sargon, who led a rebellion against the Sumerian kings and established an intercity dynasty. The Etruscan kings, or Laucum, of the 12 major city-states met up every year at the sacred grove of Voltumna to coordinate, negotiate, and celebrate with each other, near Volusna, which is modern Orvieto. It was said to be the navel of Etruria, at the center of their world. And according to Roman scholar Varro, Voltumna was the chief god of the Etruscans. He seemed to be a shape-shifting fertility god, representing the changes of the natural world. Groves of fruit and nut trees were sacred to him, because they expressed the changes of the seasons, the cycles of life, death, and resurrection. Seedlings in the spring, fruitings in the summer, harvests in the fall, and decay in the winter. His statue in the later Roman Forum was a bearded man with a long spear, but he had also been described or depicted as a young man, or a man holding or wrestling two serpents, like the Ophiuchus constellation, associated by the Romans with Asclepius, the healing demigod with a serpent on his staff, and Hercule, or Hercules, who strangled two serpents as a child and later fought the Hydra. The Chaos Kampf mytheme is seen in many cultures, pitting heroic thunder gods like Zeus, Perun, and Indra against serpentine giants like Typhon, Veles, and Vritra. When the chthonic serpents cause drought by obstructing the clouds or the headwaters of rivers, the storm god comes to the rescue, slaying the dragon and releasing the rains or rivers to fertilize the soil. If this really is Voltumna on a bronze Etruscan mirror, shaking rain out of serpents, then he fits this heroic motif. The Romans ultimately conflated Voltumna with Jupiter, so perhaps he inherited this motif from Zeus. Oddly enough, we don't have much evidence of the Etruscans, Romans, or even Gauls depicting Tinia, Tyrannus, Vejovis, Jove, Jupiter in such serpent-slaying narratives. The closest we have are depictions dated to Roman Gaul, showing a horse-riding Jupiter, resembling the horse-riding Vejovis, fighting Anguipeds, which are serpent-legged titans. The closest to this that we can find in Greece goes back to the chthonic Pelasgian founder of Athens, Cecrops, who had a serpentine lower half and introduced civilization, writing, burial, and Zeus worship to Attica. He was considered to be autochthonic, or indigenous to the region. Slightly more popular was Echidna, a supposedly Scythian Anguiped mother goddess from Hylaea, probably near the Crimea. Her partner was, who else, but Typhon. Likewise, the Babylonian heroic storm god Marduk slew the chthonic god Abzu, followed by his vengeful serpentine sea goddess partner, Tiamat. To the Sumerians, Ophiuchus was called Nira, an underworld serpentine god who was a messenger, a helper, for many other Sumerian gods, including the hero of the Sumerian chaos comp, Ninurta, predating Marduk and Baal in the Middle East. Ninurta was a chthonic god of farming, writing, and health, rather than an explicit storm god. The later Babylonian Marduk stole his thunder, because it was the pro-serpentine Ninurta who first slew Enger and Namu, the original god of the abyss and goddess of the sea, respectively. Serpentine gods and dragons were not always so demonized as they are in today's dualistic world of chthonic demons and celestial angels. Cultures across every continent have had some version of the serpent being revered and deified by their ancestors. To make my case clear, let's look at the chaos comp of Slavic myth to see how it has changed over time. There was an annual fight between the god of the dead, Veles, and the king of the gods, Perun. Perun, Slavic thunder god, defends the canopy of the world tree with thunderbolts from Veles, who took on serpentine form and attempted to coil up the tree from his place at its roots. By the time of the Dark Ages, Christian duelists painted Veles into a kind of dragon, stealing livestock and haunting horse stables, being associated with Nahas, the serpent form of the devil in the Garden of Eden. Veles was depicted by earlier Slavic pagans in a better light, as a bearded old man, a magician, musical poet, steward of forests, patron of commerce, and a dutiful king of the dead. Despite somewhat resembling Odin and the Lithuanian psychopomp Velchanos, his name actually referred to the willow tree rather than the oak tree, relating him instead to Odin's brother, Vili, or Willow in Anglo-Saxon, the Germanic god who, alongside Ve and Odin, created the world and humankind. I went into much more depth on this in my Norse gods video, so please check that out if you're interested. But another name for Vili was Elder Loki, or Lothur, a shape-shifting fertility god of land, growth, and life. He gave breath to ash and elm trees that became the first humans, Ash and Embla. Despite the myth theme of the world tree being common in Indo-European myths, it likely stems from a far earlier source, especially due to its resemblance to Semitic myth themes, like in the Garden of Eden, and Mediterranean myth themes, like the Garden of the Hesperides. The most ancient equivalent of Veles was Welnos, a reconstructed Proto-Indo-European deity who was rather a guardian of livestock, especially sheep. Perhaps this Voltumna-type deity was important to the Neolithic Anatolian farmers, who settled both Tuscany and the area around modern Moldova and Ukraine. This was the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, influencing the pastoral Yamnaya ancestors of Indo-Europeans. I'm planning another video about the origins of the Yamnaya, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, so when that comes out, I'll link it here. This, I suspect, is where the chthonic agricultural motifs of Voltumna, Welnos, and Veles might have come from, although it's likely that his chthonic serpentine aspects were already present with Western hunter-gatherers in Europe before the Neolithic. Now, the Etruscans were expert traders and craftsmen, so they enthusiastically integrated gods from neighboring cultures into their own pantheon. As Celtic, Italic, and Greek influence over Tuscany grew, widespread Indo-European motifs began to obfuscate their pre-Indo-European roots. The political significance of Voltumna and other chthonic deities was being drowned out by more celestial heroic figures like Tinia and Veovis, who more closely resembled thunder gods like Tyrannus, Jupiter, and Zeus. This mirrors a shift in many Indo-European influenced cultures, where cyclical agrarian motifs were gradually or radically sidelined for more canonical martial storylines about usurpation, war, raiding, and adventure, indicating the growing power of the warrior class in societies during the Iron Age. All Etruscan myths involving Voltumna have unfortunately been lost to time, except in the case of his Romanized form, Vertumnus. Some enigmatic agrarian characteristics are retained in his statue at the Roman Forum, which was decorated according to the seasons, almost like a Christmas tree that you kept year-round. We will come back to that later. The only surviving myth involving Vertumnus was recorded in Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, a book that covers various Greco-Roman shape-shifting deity myths, including many of Jupiter's not-so-romantic shape-shifting escapades. Similarly, in the story of Vertumnus and Pomona, Vertumnus sneaks into the sacred grove of Pomona, who's a hamadryad, or fairy tied to pomegranate trees, by taking on the form of an old lady. Once inside, he uses the clout of his disguise and a cautionary tale against rejecting potential suitors to prime her to accept his male form. The temptation of Eve by Nahas almost echoes this myth theme, but these seduction schemes of Vertumnus, Jupiter, and Zeus are quite unbecoming of a king of the gods, especially by today's standards. But even in relation to other pantheons in the classical period, sleazy schemes like these were usually relegated to controversial and uncivilized trickster gods like Pan or Loki. Zeus is given heroic character arcs like that of Marduk, Indra, Tarhona, Perun, and Tinia in his Chaos Compt struggle against the chaotic dragon, but he seemed to spend a concerning amount of time as king of Mount Olympus wandering about the world causing trouble. Pomona, meanwhile, most resembled the Roman goddesses Copia, Abundita, and Opus, often depicted holding their horn full of fruits from a bountiful harvest, the cornucopia. Opus was the equivalent of Rhea in Greek myth, the wife of Kronos. The Roman Kronos, Saturnus, comes from the word satyr, a half-man, half-goat, like Pan, and his was the basis for Satan in Roman Catholicism. The Etruscans called Kronos the same, satyr, depicting him as a demonic underworld figure, thus indicating that he was likely an import from Greek myth, where he was banished by Zeus to Tartarus. Like Voltumna being replaced by Tinia as the chief god of the Etruscans, Kronos was ultimately overthrown and replaced as king of the gods by Zeus. And if Pomona, Opus, and Copia were really the same goddess of fruitful abundance, then the Etruscan goddess, Cupra, the equivalent of Copia, might have been the wife of this satyr, or Voltumna. And the similarities don't end there. Saturnus was also a god of time, seasonal cycles, and the harvest. We might find the secret link between Kronos, Vertumnus, Voltumna, and the shape-shifting Zeus in the sacred birthplace of Zeus, Crete. According to my hypothesis in my Origins of the Etruscans video, The Etruscans were descended from Pelasgians in the Neolithic Aegean and Crete, including the Minoans. The Minoans held dominion over the Aegean, the gateway between the eastern and western Mediterranean, for most of the Bronze Age, laying the foundations for both Greek and Etruscan civilization, commerce, culture, and religion. We should therefore expect to find many precursor forms of Greek and Etruscan gods and goddesses within Minoan artifacts. There are no surviving writings from the Minoans about their own gods, so we have to piece together their pantheon by corroborating Minoan artifacts and depictions with later mythic motifs. From what archaeologists can tell, the two most important Minoan deities were a Dryadic queen mother, who later the Lydians called Kubaba, the Greeks called Rhea, and the Phrygians called Cybele, and her consort, Velchanos, the youthful god of fruits, vegetation, and seasonal cycles. The roots of Kubaba, Rhea, and Cybele are profound, going back to the deified Sumerian queen Kubaba, or further back to the dawn of the agricultural revolution in the Levant. Some of the first carved stone depictions of a queen or goddess in Anatolia. But let's save that for another video. Velchanos can indeed be identified with Voltumna. He was a mythopoetic embodiment of the fruit, which grows, falls from the tree, decays, seeds the soil, and is reborn next year. His was the original mytheme of resurrection, but far from being a canonical religious dogma, this was a cyclical religious view that reflected the way the world really was and still is today. After the Mycenaeans and Dorians conquered the Minoans, they castrated and destroyed the statues and likenesses of Velchanos across Crete. By the time of the classical Greek period, what remained of Velchanos was referred to as the markedly younger and more chthonic Cretan Zeus. According to Hesiod, Rhea saved Zeus from being devoured by Kronos as a baby, hiding him away in a cave on Mount Ida in Crete. There he was raised by a wild goat goddess named Amalthea. When Zeus finally came of age, after spending his entire youth in Crete, he usurped Kronos and saved his brothers and sisters, becoming king of the gods. By some accounts, Zeus also became the consort of his own mother, Rhea, who thereafter was known as Demeter.
Velchanos of Crete was also said to have educated the band of the Curetes initiates in writing, wine brewing, and smithing. On the island of Lemnos in the Aegean, Hephaestus was considered the initiator of the Cabiroi, or the Corybantes, who guarded Zeus, Velchanos, and Attis when they were raised in the wild as children. And the indigenous language of Lemnos, Lemnian, is related to Etruscan. Thus, there may even be a connection between Hephaestus, Vulcan, Velcans, and Voltumna Velchanos.
Next, I'd like to tell you the myth of Cybele and Attis from Phrygian and Lydian mythology. This myth is thought to have originated from the Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia, possibly the Hattians, passing down this mytheme to the migrant Indo-European Lydians, who were related to Hittites, and Phrygians, who were related to Thracians. As the story goes, the sky god Sabazios, Thracian Phrygian Zeus, was flying past Mount Agdos one day, when he saw a rock or statue, Agdis, which was carved into the shape of a woman, possibly Gaia or the Anatolian mother goddess. He did what Zeus would do, and where his seed fell onto the mountain, it grew into the giant Agdistis, who terrorized the world, similar to the Hurrian giant of eastern Anatolia, Ulikumi. Zagreus, Phrygian Dionysus, castrated and defeated the giant, and an almond or pomegranate tree grew where the giant's seed landed. Later, a princess named Nana ate one of the almonds or pomegranates, becoming pregnant with Attis. After he was born, Nana's father, King Singarius, banished Attis into the wilderness, where he was raised by a wild goat and the queen, Cybele. Ultimately, Attis became her consort. Cybele came to adore him so much that when he was to be wed to the mortal daughter of King Midas, either Marigold or Zoe, Cybele's jealousy drove Attis into a frenzied madness, where he castrated himself under a pine tree and died. His blood fertilized the soil, allowing violet flowers to grow there. Cybele pleaded with Sabazios to resurrect him, but instead, Sabazios allowed his body to remain preserved, never to decay. It is said that his hair continued to grow, becoming the grasses and flowers of the earth. In other versions of the story, he was partially resurrected as an evergreen tree or an immortal god. His tragedy was carried on by the Orphic cult and the later Roman Mithraic cult, becoming the basis for the ritual of the Christmas tree. His resurrection resembles the myth themes of various dying and resurrecting gods, like Osiris, Balder, Adonis, Demusid, and so on. Even Adonis was the son of a dryadic tree goddess named Smyrna. Now, just because deities have similar myth themes doesn't necessarily mean they're the same deity. That's not necessarily the argument I'm trying to make here. Deities evolve and diverge across cultures. I can save these resurrection deities as well for another video. Suffice it to say, the resemblance between Attis and Velchanos is quite evident. I will leave you with one last character from American folklore. John Chapman was an American pioneer in the early 1800s who introduced apple seeds across the Ohio Valley. His life story evolved into a legend where a young pioneer named Johnny Appleseed wandered across the country carrying apples and accidentally leaving apple seeds wherever he went, leading to a widespread growth of apple trees throughout the country. This, I imagine, might have been the way that the legend of Attis spread across the Mediterranean during the Neolithic. Neolithic settlers from Anatolia and the Levant didn't just spread staple cereals like wheat, barley, and rye. They also brought with them tree seeds like pomegranate, almond, fig, olive, pistachio, plum, pear, mulberry, and oak with more edible acorns.
Trying to imagine the original Voltumna through this kaleidoscope of influences, it seems to me that Zeus and Jupiter didn't just evolve from the Indo-European thunder god, Perquunos, but also from this older Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age consort to the great mother of the agricultural revolution. He seems to have been a bit younger and wilder than Kronos, integrating aspects of Pan and the wandering Dionysus, yet more responsible for the happenings of the state, almost resembling the dynamic traits of Shiva. The thread of Voltumna leads us in many directions, towards mad-smithing gods like Vulcan, to lost serpentine gods like Ophion, resurrecting fertility gods like Osiris, changeling trickster gods like Loki, wild forest gods like Pan, and seasonal harvest gods like Saturnus. The connections are frankly too many to cover in one video, but I'm curious what else you find. Please tell me what you think in the comments, and we can carry on the investigation via any of my upcoming comparative mythology live streams. I'm attempting to reconstruct a kind of West Asian Neolithic or Pelasgian pantheon. I'm starting by pulling on the strings of Etruscan mythology. Which Etruscan thread would you have me pull on next time? Thank you, as always, for watching.